What's going on, everybody? Khalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my first impressions of the iPhone 15 Pro Max. Now, if you've been watching my videos for a while, then you probably know I don't typically cover higher end devices like this, but I was getting this phone anyway, so I figured I might as well. Now, I'm probably not going to do a ton of videos on it, but you can expect to see several comparisons here and there on the channel, so if you are interested in this phone, then definitely stay tuned. Another thing I do want to point out here is that considering this is my personal phone, I do have a few accessories on it, so I will be linking to them in the video description. But while this kinda goes without saying, the iPhone 15 Pro Max does not come with a case, or a camera protector, or a screen protector either. So definitely keep this in mind. But again, if you do have this phone, or you're considering getting it, and you are interested in these accessories, I will be linking to them in the video description. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, as you would probably expect from a top-of-the-line phone like this, we are getting a really nice display here. With this phone, we're getting a 6.7-inch 120Hz LTPO Super Retina XDR OLED display with a resolution of 1290 by 2796, so a little bit better than 1080p. We're also getting a PPI of 460 and a 19.5 by 9 aspect ratio. So again, as you would probably expect from a phone like this, the display is great in pretty much every way. With this OLED kind of display, we are getting really good image quality. The colors look great. The viewing angles are really good, so no matter where you are, whether you're outside in the sun and really bright lighting, or just in a normal room, no matter what, things are going to be real easy to see. The 120Hz refresh rate is going to give us nice smooth motion on the screen. And in general, whether you're doing stuff like watching videos, where the image quality is a lot more important, or you're doing more simple things like browsing the web or just using the phone as a phone, regardless, you will get a great experience no matter what. Now for storage, with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, this phone does have several different options. For me personally, I just have the 256GB version because in my experience, I've never really used that much storage anyway. But keep in mind, if you are a bit more of a power user, you can also get it in 512 and 1TB. But keep in mind, unfortunately with this phone, like pretty much any high-end device, it does not have microSD card expansion. So if you're coming from maybe a lower-end device that does have that feature, you will be disappointed here. That being said though, I do want to point out that while there are definitely some drawbacks that are specific to iPhones, not having microSD card expansion is really not one of them, because compared to pretty much any phone in this general category, none of them are going to have it either. I mean, the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, or the S23 FE for that matter, and the Google Pixel phones as far as I know, none of those phones are going to have microSD card expansion. In fact, even this Motorola Razr, which it's dead right now, but the point is, I got this phone for under $300 on sale. And because it's still technically a higher end device, this phone doesn't have microSD card expansion either. So if you are coming from maybe a lower end Android phone, for example, and you are used to having microSD card expansion, just keep in mind, iPhones are by far not the only phones that don't have this feature, because when it comes to higher end devices, at this point in 2023, you're really not going to find this feature in any of them. That being said though, you can get variants of this phone that have honestly a lot of storage. I feel like the average user is not going to come close to using up a terabyte, or maybe even 256GB for that matter. So yeah, I feel like in general, unless you really want to use a microSD card specifically, storage is probably not going to be an issue with this phone. But again, if you are coming from a lower end device that does have microSD card expansion, or maybe you just have an older flagship phone and you're expecting every phone at this point in 2023 to still have microSD card expansion, then again, keep in mind, unfortunately that's not the case. Now for security features, with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, unfortunately this phone does not have a fingerprint scanner, and if you're coming from an Android phone and you really do like to use your fingerprint scanner, then that definitely will be disappointing for you, because when it comes to iPhones, for whatever reason, I feel like it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but no iPhone ever since I think the iPhone 8 is going to have a fingerprint scanner, but at least it does have Face Unlock, and it's kind of hard to demonstrate here, but as you can see, it does work decently well, so let's try that one more time. So there we go. So in general, I know for some people, Face Unlock might not be the most convenient thing to have to use, but I feel like if you use it for long enough, you will probably get used to it. But of course, if you really do want a fingerprint scanner, then considering this is like a $1,200 phone, you're definitely not going to want to spend all this money on a phone just to not have a feature that you really want. So if it is important to you, then definitely keep this in mind. But if a fingerprint scanner isn't really the most important feature in the world to you, then Face Unlock might be just fine for you. Now taking a look at the camera setup here with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, up front we got a 12 megapixel selfie camera, which might not sound like a whole lot, but I will say in general, the selfie camera does work really well. Remember, at this point in 2023, this is really one of the highest end phones there is, so despite not having like 30 or 40 megapixels, the camera here is definitely still really high quality. So if you're maybe a content creator, maybe you're taking lots of selfies or recording lots of videos, maybe you do like vlogging or something, then in general, despite again only being 12 megapixels, at this point in time, this is still probably one of the best selfie cameras you can get. Now on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 48 megapixel main camera, a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera, and a 12 megapixel telephoto lens. Now, like I said earlier in the video, this is not what the camera actually looks like. I did put a tempered glass cover on it. The phone was really expensive and I don't want to take any chances considering it is my personal phone, but I will say from my experience so far, although I haven't really done a ton with the camera yet, from what I've seen it is really good. And although it is obviously debatable whether this phone is better than Samsung's equivalent, I will say compared to past iPhones I've had, the 15 Pro Max is definitely a significant improvement. So if you're coming from maybe an iPhone 13 for example, which was my personal phone before this, and you're considering upgrading, then I would say if you are really using the camera a lot, you won't be disappointed here. That being said though, I do want to point out for the average user, I seriously doubt you're gonna need a camera like this. I mean, if you're really just taking the occasional photo every now and then to send to friends and family or maybe use for something like Instagram or maybe even something like Snapchat where the photo quality isn't too important and that kind of situation, although of course the camera will absolutely get the job done, you could probably get away with spending a lot less because nowadays, I mean, smartphone cameras are getting so good that the average person for typical daily use is probably not going to need 25x zoom or a really insanely high quality camera in general. So on one hand, if you are really taking a lot of pictures and that's really the main thing you're doing with your phone, maybe you're into mobile photography and that kind of situation, I could definitely see this camera being worth it. But again, at the same time, if you're really just looking for something that has a good camera, but you don't really need a ton of features or super high quality, then I would definitely seriously think hard about spending this much money on a phone like this because chances are it's not really necessary. And then also keep in mind for video, this phone can record in up to 4K at 60 frames per second in both the rear and front cameras. So again, great if you're recording a lot of videos, but keep in mind from what I've seen, this is still not actually the highest resolution out there. I mean, with the Samsung Galaxy S23 FE, which is significantly lower end than this, that phone can record in 8K at least 24 frames per second, and although the average person is probably never gonna need to record in 8K, considering the S23 FE is like Samsung's entry-level flagship phone, I'm assuming the S23 Ultra is even better. So maybe if you really want to get the absolute best video recording quality there is, you might want to consider the S23 Ultra before this phone. Now, I can't really say that from experience considering I don't have that phone, but when it comes to this kind of price range, chances are you might be looking for the absolute best, and if video recording is super important to you, then I'm just saying you might want to look into Samsung too. Now to give you a quick idea of what this camera can do, here's some pictures taken with the iPhone 15 Pro Max. So as you can see, the photo quality here is really good. So in general, for 99% of people, if you are looking for a phone to take really high quality photos, you definitely won't be disappointed with the camera here. Now for the RAM and processor, with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, we're getting 8GB of RAM with the Apple A17 Pro processor. Now, I don't know exactly off the top of my head if this is actually the fastest phone in the world. Maybe Samsung has a beat this year, I really couldn't say. But I will say, if it's not the exact fastest phone out there, it's definitely close enough to it to the point where if you really want a phone with significantly more power than this, then you're probably going to be disappointed because I really don't think it exists. But in general, no matter what you're doing on your phone, whether you're just simply browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that, or you're doing more complex things like editing videos, doing high performance mobile gaming, really pretty much anything, you are going to get a great experience with this phone because, again, when it comes to processing power, I really don't think there's a phone out there that can beat it. Now, obviously by the time you're watching this, maybe the S24 Ultra comes out and that phone ends up being a lot faster, so of course, things could change, but the general point here is if you're looking for a fast phone, the iPhone 15 Pro Max is going to be one of your best options, so if you are really concerned with performance, then this definitely could be the phone for you. Now, I ran a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6, and as you can see right here, we got some pretty impressive scores, with a single core score of 2949 and a multi-core score of 7485. So again, I don't really think that any phone out there currently can beat this. So in general, if you are looking for a really fast phone and that's the most important thing to you, and you don't mind paying a little or a lot more for it, then of course this phone is definitely worth considering. Now for the battery, with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, we're getting a 4,441 mAh battery that supports 20 watt fast charging as well as 15 watt wireless charging. Now, I kind of have mixed feelings about this battery because on one hand, as someone who's been using iPhones for years now, I will say for an iPhone, the battery life here is pretty impressive and the charging speed is pretty good too. That being said though, considering that most of the phones I cover on this channel are Android phones, I will say there are plenty of Android phones out there that have much better battery life than this, and those phones are all a lot more affordable too. So if battery life is really a main priority for you, then this phone or really any iPhone is probably not going to be the best choice for you. But again, I will say for an iPhone, the battery life is pretty good and the charging speed, despite not being the best, is pretty decent too, so I will give it that. But again, if you are looking for a phone that has really amazing battery life, then you definitely could be disappointed here because despite not being bad, there are plenty of phones out there that not only have much better battery life, but are also quite a bit more affordable too. Now for the software, this phone does have iOS 17, and this is one area where compared to an Android phone, it's really hard to make an actual comparison on which one is better because at the end of the day, at this point, I've been using Android and iOS for like ever, and I really feel like one's not specifically better than the other. It really just depends on your preferences. So if you are in that situation where you have either iOS or Android and you're considering switching to the other, I definitely recommend trying out the other software first because again, I personally don't feel like one is specifically better than the other, but they are really different. And if you're really used to one, you may not end up liking the other a whole lot. But I will say from my experience, iOS is really user-friendly and it does have AirDrop, which is one of my favorite features about iPhones. If you are transferring a lot of files from device to device, which granted not everyone is, but if you are in that kind of situation where you do that kind of thing a lot, I mean, for me personally, I use phones to record pretty much every video on this channel, so having AirDrop to transfer from my phone to a computer is definitely nice. But of course, if you're not really doing a ton of that kind of thing, AirDrop is probably going to be irrelevant to you. And then of course, when it comes to stuff like iMessage, for example, I personally like iMessage a lot. It's definitely part of why I personally use iOS, but some people might not really care about it. So at the end of the day, when it comes to specific OS kind of stuff, most of it is really based on personal preference. So definitely keep this in mind. Now, taking a look at the overall design here, I did take the case off just so you could see it better. But in general, I feel like it has the classic iPhone design compared to something like the iPhone 12, 13, 14. It doesn't really look a whole lot different. Again, keep in mind with the camera here, I do have an extra cover on it myself, but as you can see, the camera module still is pretty big. But in general, I feel like the phone has a nice, sleek, modern design. And as you would expect from a phone like this, it does feel pretty premium. It also doesn't have a ton of weight to it too, which I feel like that's one of the main things about this phone they've been hyping up. It does have a titanium frame, so despite being really durable, it's not quite as heavy. But in general, I feel like the design, despite not being really that different, it still feels pretty nice, so overall I have no complaints. Now, one thing that's different from pretty much any other iPhone here is this action button right here. Now, if you're not really familiar with iPhones, then this might not really mean a whole lot, considering most Android phones have pretty much the same kind of thing. Well, maybe not exactly the same functionality, but essentially this is like a little shortcut button. When you first get the phone, it basically starts out as kind of like a mute button. So you press it and it goes to mute mode, but you can customize what it does. So for me personally, I set it to open the camera. So if I press and hold it, as you can see, the camera opens right up. Now, again, pretty much every Android phone for as long as I've ever been using Android can do this. So if you are coming from Android, then this is not really going to be impressive, but it is nice that Apple's finally adding some extra features here. So definitely not a bad thing to have. But in conclusion, my overall first impressions of the iPhone 15 Pro Max. Now, in general, it's not like it's really significantly different from other iPhones I've had. Compared to my iPhone 13, I mean, the display, really just because it's a Pro Max and not like the regular base model, it is a bit nicer. I mean, it's larger than my iPhone 13. The display quality is arguably a bit nicer, and in general, when I'm doing stuff like watching videos, for example, things do look really nice. Performance-wise, I feel like honestly with any phone above like Samsung Galaxy S23 FE level, you're not really gonna notice the performance difference too much. Sure, this phone is on paper significantly faster than pretty much every other phone at this point in 2023, but at the same time, I mean, in my experience, there's not really a ton you can do on this phone that you can't with, say, the Samsung Galaxy S23 FE, or really any kind of old flagship phone you can get for $500 or less. And when it comes to the camera, I feel like that's really the best part about this phone. For me personally, my iPhone 13 already did have a really good camera, but with this phone, I am seeing significant improvements, so I am happy with this. But at the same time, again, if you're really really not using your camera that much, if you're not doing like serious mobile photography or some kind of content creation, then chances are spending $1,200 on just a nice camera is probably not worth it. Now, of course, this is really subjective, and if you simply just like taking really nice photos, then by all means, it could be a great choice for you. But if you are specifically going for the camera and maybe you don't really care about whether you get an iPhone or a Samsung or whatever, again, I do highly recommend considering your options because, again, at $1,200, unlike most devices I cover on this channel, this is not a cheap phone. So if cost is really important to you, then depending on what you need, there are almost certainly better options out there. For example, even if you really want an iPhone, you could easily get something like the iPhone 12 or 13, and now since those phones have been out for a couple years, they are going to be quite a bit cheaper, so definitely keep this in mind. But if you do have maybe a bit of a higher budget and you're looking for a premium device that has pretty much the best performance you can get, a really nice camera, a great display, and you're overall looking for a high-end flagship experience, then in that case, this could be a great phone for you. And again, in my experience, for an iPhone compared to other iPhones I've had, it's maybe not like a night and day kind of difference, but regardless, I definitely do think it is a noticeable improvement. Now, once again, for the latest info on pricing and availability, as well as the accessories I got for this phone, be sure to check out the description. And again, I will be making a few videos about this phone in the future, so stay tuned for that. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.